Are you looking for hot takes and guests yelling over top of each other? Well, you came to the wrong place. This is the final word, where we talks about sports like they used to. All opinions are welcome, but that doesn't mean you are right. Hosted by Greg Rector. Welcome in.
Good evening, everybody. This is Greg Rector, and I'm at Greg Cowboys on X and all that other fun sort of stuff. And this is our look back at the Super Bowl. Now, Super Bowl 1 and 2 were not really called the Super Bowl. They were the AFL and NFL World Championships. Super Bowl 1 was played at the Memorial Coliseum in Los Angeles, and the Green Bay Packers go out and pretty much destroy the Kansas City Chiefs 35-10. Of course, the highlight of the first Super Bowl was the play of Max McGee, the backup wide receiver who had been out the night before with another cohort of his, Mr. Paul Hornung.
Yeah.
Mr. McGee didn't even have his helmet. He left it in the locker room and had to borrow somebody else's when Dowler got injured for the Green Bay Packers, and he went out to, just catch 7 passes, 138 yards, and 2 touchdowns in Super Bowl 1. He did score another touchdown in his final game, Super Bowl 2, against the Oakland Raiders. The Oakland Raiders, of course, did not fare very well either against Mr. Lombardi's Green Bay Packers, as they lost that game 33-14. But Super Bowl 1, as it's known as, was the only time that two NFL networks covered the same game. NBC and CBS, but the CBS feed was the only one that was used by NBC. So that's the only time that's ever happened. What did you make of the first 2 Super Bowl games?
Yeah, well, I've watched each one a couple of times, and the first thing that jumps out to you is the murderous efficiency of the offensive line of the Green Bay Packers. And while you'll often hear people tell you, the players of this era could not have played in that era and blah, 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 blah. I mean, the average weight of the offensive line, was something like 253 pounds. So would those guys have to be bigger now? Yes. But they were incredibly athletic, right? I mean, every single one of those guys could run. And there were times when Paul Hornung would be, running full out, and he wouldn't be getting ahead. It was almost advantageous, I guess, that some of your running backs were not faster than your offensive linemen, because nowadays, eventually they sort of pull away and then they lose the protection of that offensive line. But they would stay, in the hip of those offensive linemen 20, 30, sometimes 15, 20, 30 yards down the field. Because those guys, Jerry Kramer was an exceptional athlete. Fuzzy Thurston was a very good athlete. The whole Skoranek, who of course has a grandson now in the NFL, not Skoranek. What's his name? The one that has a grandson who plays for the Titans. Skoronski. Thank you. But they were all extremely, Fuzzy Thurston, the whole bunch, extremely athletic, and Ringo, of course, being probably the best pure athlete of the bunch. But they would get out, right, the classic Packer sweep, and they would just cut people down like a scythe. I mean, it was just incredibly impressive to watch. And then the defensive line is somewhat forgotten and overshadowed, but a terrific defense. And so those games, like so many games, were won and lost in the trenches. Those 2 AFL teams held their own in some areas, right? They held their own in sort of the offensive back, the running back to comparisons, the wide receiver comparisons, the quarterback comparisons, and the wide receiver on wide receiver comparisons. Where the difference, those 2 games, right? The 25-point difference in one and the 15-point difference in the other one are both completely, or I tried the first time, right? 33. Yeah, whatever. We're both explained completely by the line play. And the defensive line of the Kansas City was a really good one, a really, really good one. Like, I want to make it clear to you that these are not busted. There was a bunch of guys on that defensive line who could play for anybody. And Bobby Bell could play right now. A lot of people like to say Bobby Bell you could take, if you took Bobby Bell in his prime and dropped him into football in any era, Bobby Bell was one of the best players on the field in any era.
Yep.
He might be better now because his coverage ability was somewhat underutilized, whatever, because they didn't throw the ball as much, but he could cover. Name a tight end, he could cover them all. Name a running back, he could cover them all. He probably ran in the mid to low 4.5s. He was 228 pounds and 6'3" 3/4. He'd be a little heavier now just because of weight training and nutrition, but he'd probably run even faster. He was a freak of nature. He'd be on the Feldman freak list, right? If that existed in his day. So this is a good team. Both those AFL teams were good teams. But the difference to me was just line play. And by the time we're going to talk obviously about Super Bowl III in a second, you can see how much things have caught up in that all-important area, right? Which decided the first two Super Bowls. I came away, and I guess I've watched a couple of those a couple of different times, having to remind myself that once again, Vince Lombardi, at his heart of hearts, was an offensive lineman and an offensive line coach, right?
Yeah.
And of course, we all know he originated or was the first offensive coordinator in NFL history. But whatever his title, coordinator, head coach, he was always an offensive lineman and an offensive line coach at his heart of hearts, right? Yeah. A member of the Fordham 7 Groks of Blended himself, a terrific, though undersized little quick guard himself. Lombardi was, playing at 180 something pounds and about 5'9", but was, despite that, a tremendous offensive lineman, just undersized. But that's what just jumps out to me when you go back and watch and rewatch. Turnovers, like every other game that's important, is hugely important. But even without the turnovers, I think that the Packers would eventually worn down those two AFL teams. But once they began turning the ball over, that was it. But yeah, just the ruthless. It's like watching a cavalry charge, Greg. Right?
Yeah. Oh, it was an absolute beating from the offensive line of the Packers on both the Raiders and the Chiefs. Yep. And like you said, Bobby Bell, I don't care any era you want to put that man into, he would be a superstar in the NFL. Bottom line.
Yep.
Then, of course, we had the very first Super Bowl,
right?
Super Bowl III.
Yep.
And that featured the Baltimore Colts, who were still part of the NFL at this point.
Correct.
Facing the New York Jets and Joe Willie Namath, who, of course, before the game, guaranteed that the Jets were going to win, even though they were pretty heavy underdogs.
Yep.
And, of course, they did go out and beat the Baltimore Colts 16-7.
Yes.
Go ahead.
But what jumps out at me is, despite the, sort of the braggadocio and everything associated with the prediction, it was the most game managerial game maybe of his entire career, right? Namath was the most boring quarterback you've ever seen was in that game. He here Matt Snell, here, he was handing the ball up to Emerson Boozer and stepping out of the way. That game was decided by Sonny Grantham and Jerry Philbin, and just Woodson, just terrific defense. And shout out to, he wasn't a coordinator by name, but their linebacker coach, a very young Buddy Ryan, put together a tremendous game plan. And, he was the de facto defensive coordinator of one of the most brilliant defensive performances. And though the old and sort of banged up Colts, sort of limped into that game, they were once again a great team. And, Hall of Famers here, there, and everywhere still on that team, but they were aging, right? And it showed at times.
Yeah.
But once again, the offensive line of the Jets don't get enough credit for that. To me, it's the defense of the Jets and the offensive line of the Jets. There's not a single Hall of Famer on that offensive line. I think only on that offensive line of the Jets, I think only Winston Hill has even been a finalist, I think.
I think so. I think that was the only.
I think he's been a seniors committee finalist before.
Yeah,
but I don't think anybody on that line has even come super close to making the Hall of Fame. But they were dominant. Once again, against a very good Colts defense. They just pushed them around. This was one of the better defenses of that era, and they got pushed around. Greg, pushed around. And that game was the running game and defense, right? The Jets' running game, which the Colts could never really stop, and then their defense, just every time was a big play. They knocked around an already beaten up Unitas, and as well as um, uh, I was just talking about this guy as a possible sort of dark horse, eventual seniors committee Hall of Famer.
Raymond Berry.
Well, no, not with him too, but I'm talking about the backup quarterback from Michigan
Earl
State.
Morrall.
Yeah, Earl Morrall, and eventually Tom Maddie.
And Maddie, Tom Maddie. Yeah,
was taking snaps as an emergency quarterback. They beat those guys up really pretty good.
Yeah.
So it was impressive to me how, and once again, that defense, right?
Oh, that defense was just nasty.
But once again, not a lot of votes for the Hall of Fame for those guys.
Nope.
I think Philbin has been maybe a semifinalist as a senior committee guy. I don't think Grantham's even been that. I mean, despite how good they were, none of those guys has even threatened to make the Hall of Fame. But it was a terrific defense.
And then after losing the first Super Bowl, Hank Stram, Lenny Dawson come back, and they pound, and I mean pound, the Minnesota Vikings, 23-7.
Yep.
And that ends the era of the Super Bowls without the Vince Lombardi Trophy.
Correct.
The Vince Lombardi Trophy started at Super Bowl V. Yep. This is going to be one of my 3 disaster discussions. All 3 took place at the same place. Do you know what place they took place?
Not the Orange Bowl.
Yeah, it is. It's the Orange Bowl.
Yeah, okay.
The Orange Bowl, which is what a hellacious place it turned out to be for the Cowboys. But anyhow, the Colts win it on a field goal by Jim O'Brien. It was 16-13.
Yep.
And again, they are the first winners of the Vince Lombardi Trophy.
Yep. And almost like a broken record, but the running game and the defenses once again decided this game.
Bingo.
So I wish I had something more exciting to say, but look at the line play. Now, once again, Dallas has a great defense, right? And Chuck Howley, to this day, the first defender, obviously, be a Super Bowl MVP, but the only player from a losing team
to win the Super Bowl MVP award.
And he was both, right? And he had a game for the ages. And Chuck Howley took forever to make the Hall of Fame, speaking of the Hall of Fame, which, I don't know, I never got that. I mean, Sam Huff got in, and these are 2 very similar players. Huff is bigger, but both West Virginia guys, both could do whatever you needed them to do from the middle linebacker position. And Howley was a great coverage linebacker. Another guy that might be even better nowadays than he was in his day. 6'1", 228 pounds.
Yeah.
Probably ran about 4.7 flat. And was mostly playing downhill in those days because we played run game first. And, those most good teams ran the ball darn near 60% of the time in those days. But when you saw him in coverage, he really came alive to me. Like, look at this guy, right? He's basically the prototype of Jack Ham, right? Who sort of invents the coverage, helps to invent the coverage linebacker as we now think of it in the modern sense. Howley had tremendous range, off the charts football IQ, and I guess the greatest compliment is that Tom Landry said that, he's maybe the smartest defender he's ever coached. And you couldn't play for Landry unless you were smart because his defense has always had a lot of, once again, the man is an engineer by training, right? Aeronautical engineer, was a bombardier navigator on B-24 who flew 55, I think, combat missions over Europe. And so he literally used a lot of engineering principles and feedback principles and all these other things. If you ever read his writings about his defense, you really talk about stepping your game up mentally. He was so far ahead of what everyone else thought, and he would correct people down to like inches, right? You need to move this foot back this number of inches and turn your shoulders, and everything was precision with him. But they were no match for. And once again, we just talked about this with the shoe being on the other foot, right? You had the dominant NFL teams because of their line play. Then it switches, right? Kansas City Chiefs, Jim Tyrer and that bunch, who I know he did a terrible thing. And of course, I think we now know CTE was probably at the root of what happened to Jim Tyrer,
Right.
but that's the guy who should be in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
He was the best left tackle of his era, right? And I feel like
that's before left tackle was a real big thing in the NFL.
Right. I understand people didn't talk about it as much in those days. Yeah. Once again, the run game was still predominant, even with the, by that day's standards, aerial circus that the Chiefs were. They still ran the ball well over 50% of the time.
Yes.
And they had power backs like Jack Holmes and had quick backs like Mike Garrett, and threw the ball to the running backs more than really most anybody else did in that era. But they pushed around a good defense physically, right? Yeah. The Vikings were a great defense, but undersized. Their heaviest defensive lineman was Larson, who was listed at about 269 or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Marshall and Eller and
Marshall was 237.
Yeah.
And Alan Page was generously listed at 244, but probably less. And Eller was generously listed at 250, which was probably about 246, but this got pushed around. And then, we now get to this Super Bowl, this great Dallas defense just getting, frankly, dug out at times and moved around. And once again, the passing games for both teams were somewhat muted. If you look back at the passing statistics,
it's pretty low. It's pretty low, boys.
Yep. Yeah. But what jumps out at you is time of possession, right? The team that won time of possession won all of the first several Super Bowls.
Yeah, and the Colts did have the ball for, I think, 7 or 8 minutes more than the Cowboys did that day.
Yep.
And of course, this was the turning point for Thomas Landry as well, because he had never ever spoken to his players from his heart. He was always this business, straight-laced coach, et cetera, et cetera. Technocrat, exactly. Well, the next year, they get the Miami Dolphins at Tulane Stadium, and they put on a show. The lowest scoring team in the Super Bowl history is the Miami Dolphins, kids. The Cowboys' doomsday defense basically just destroyed the Dolphins 24-3. And
once again, defense and running game, right? I mean, I know very much a broken record, but all of these early Super Bowls are completely about defense and running game. And once again, a great offensive line, right? I mean, the way that people would later talk about the Cowboys' offensive line is how people of the 70s talked about that Miami Dolphins offensive line.
Right.
They were mobile and hostile and not at all fragile. They showed you, once again, they had, guys who could, I mean, Zonka is literally the picture of a power back. Probably runs about 4'8", 245-ish pounds.
250. He was a big man. He was a huge man.
And all he would do.
He was that era's version of Derrick Henry. Okay.
Only much slower. It was like a slower version, but all it would do is just 2 yards, 3 yards, 4 yards, 2 yards, 3 yards, 4 yards. And then halfway through the third quarter, now it's 7 yards, 8 yards. And then into the fourth quarter, it's 12 yards, 15 yards. And it's the same plays.
But they also had Jim Kick, and they had Paul Warfield as the receiver. I mean, this was
Morris.
Mercury Morris was there. This was no joke of an NFL team, folks. But the Cowboys' doomsday defense basically destroyed the Miami Dolphins that day. They destroyed them.
They were everywhere, right? And once again, they were able to. I mean, run fits are everything in a game like this. If you want to show somebody teaching tape on run fits, like you want to see basically one of the closest against you to a perfect game run fits wise, right? They go against one of the great running attacks in the history of NFL football, one of the greatest of all time. And they said, we're going to, go ahead. Try to beat us running the football. And you would see that bunch, right? D.D. Lewis and the aforementioned Chuck Howley. And, I think this is towards the end of Bob Lilly's career, but he was still Bob Lilly.
He was still Mr. Cowboy. This is where the title came through for Bob Lilly. He was Mr. Cowboy at that point.
He had a tremendous game. Until amongst the interior line play performances in a Super Bowl, it's the greatest until Manny Fernandez, just a little bit later. But until I saw Manny Fernandez, that was the best defender on the interior. Best interior defenders Super Bowl I'd ever seen was Bob Lilly. Because not only was he making plays himself, but he was creating plays. He was making plays for other people by crashing in there and forcing that offensive line to deal with him. And he played, it felt like 93% of the snaps. I might be exaggerating slightly, but he didn't seem to take much rest, despite the fact he was in his 30s at the time.
Yeah. And again, he is Mr. Cowboy for that reason. I mean, he was an original member of the Cowboys.
Yep.
He'd been there for, all those seasons, and he just stood on his he just stood up anybody that was on the offensive line. He would stop them in the backfield. He was just tremendous that day. Now the next season, the Dallas Cowboys met the Washington Redskins in a playoff game, and it was a disaster show for the Cowboys penalty-wise. They were penalized up the wazoo, and the Miami Dolphins had already won the AFC Championship, who had not lost a single game that season.
Right.
And as soon as they saw the Dallas Cowboys lose to the Washington Redskins, they said, "We're winning the Super Bowl." Because they didn't want to play. They didn't want to go up against the flex defense ever again. They did not want that. They didn't want anything to do with the Dallas Cowboys and that defense. And Larry Zonka's even said that, right? If we had to play those Cowboys again, that unbeaten season is more than likely not going to happen. Well, so again, the unbeaten season though, they did beat the Redskins 14-7. Which, it turned out to be an enjoyable day for me, being, a Dallas fan, and seeing Washington lose the Super Bowl is just that's music to my ears.
Lost in the greatness of that game is how well the defense of Washington played. I mean, I understand how it gets sort of lost in the sauce of it, but Chris Hamburger, Ron McDowell, Brundage, all that over the hill. Brig Owens, right? The great Kenny Houston. I know that safety play is hard to watch, especially if you're not done of all 22. If you can somehow just concentrate on number 27 in the mustard and burgundy and white. Kenny Houston has a tremendous game. And once again, it's not mostly in the passing game because, well, frankly, like once again, the broken record continues to come around. Both teams just run the football. The Washington threw the ball because they couldn't run the ball. They didn't want to throw the ball. They were also built around their running attack, and they had a young, might have been his rookie year, come to think of it, but they had a young, powerful, though small back, about 5'8.5", 203 pounds, named Larry Brown from Kansas State University.
Yep.
And he had actually, no, it was his second year in the league. Had been he was the last of the Lombardi draft picks, right? That was the last year that Lombardi was the coach / GM before his cancer overtook him. And he was a late round pick, I think 8th rounder, which doesn't even exist anymore. But he was one of those guys who just didn't care about his body at all. That's how I can explain it. He would run to darkness, right? You hear people running to daylight? No. Larry Brown, despite being not the biggest guy in the world, ran to darkness. He ran into big people for a living, and to the tune of over 1,400 yards. So it was an impressive thing to watch in a 14-game season. He's averaging 100 yards a game, despite that he's not the biggest, the fastest, or the strongest, just utterly fearless running back. And, you have the sort of eventual passing of the torch, so it hasn't happened yet between Jurgensen and Kilmer. It hasn't happened yet, but Kilmer is breathing down Jurgensen's neck for Washington, and there's a bit of a quarterback controversy coming out of that camp. And this is, the team has got some great players on it too, but it's just, they're called the Over the Hill Gang for a reason, right? It's a team. Larry, their coach, didn't much like rookies, as it's been.
George Allen is the man.
George Allen went on the record as saying, rookies make mistakes. I want them to make mistakes for someone else.
Yep.
And so he would always go out and trade his draft picks. And to his credit, he brought back guys like McDole and Brundage and all these guys. Some of these guys that played for him before at the Rams. Guys he faced it, with other teams. McDole came, I think, from the Buffalo Bills, but it was just a collection of guys, including some very old players. Sam Huff, right? Speaking of old,
Sam Huff, that's right.
Sam Huff at the very end of his career, right? Playing with the young and impressive Chris Hamburger, one of the few homegrown, along with the aforementioned Larry Brown, one of the few homegrown talents on the team, right? But Jurgensen had come from the Eagles. Just this collection of old, some almost broken down players with a sprinkling of young guys just to sort of hold it together. To their credit, that game was much closer than any business being because they got shoved around on both sides of the ball. And once again, I just talked about how utterly dominant Bob Lilly was. Well, what almost wiped that out of my mind was the ridiculous play of one Manny Fernandez. And he had a very short career. But
this guy was just phenomenal. Manny Fernandez, he destroyed the Washington offense by himself that day. By himself.
And he did it to a lot of other people. It wasn't just him. He was for about a 4 or 5 year stretch. Manny Fernandez was the best interior lineman until Aaron Charles Donald came along. I couldn't think of somebody who could do that. And he did it obviously a little bit longer because he had about a 10-year career, was great every year. Fernandez had only about a 4 or 5 year run of dominance. His career began a little bit later for some reason, then it ended early. But good Lord, was he unstoppable in that game. I don't know. I don't know if tackles for loss were even tabulated at that time as an official statistic, but he must have had about 5.5 or 6 of them. And then
he was in the backfield all day long.
Even when he didn't tackle the ball carrier, he made them change direction. Or he forced the quarterback to, stumble or move to his left or his right or double clutch. So whatever the statistics say, double it, right? His impact was double whatever the actual statistics say.
Exactly.
Until John Randall, Warren Sapp, I never saw any of them quite impact a game like that.
Yeah.
It isn't until, like I said, you got to get to Aaron Charles Donald before I saw an interior lineman affect a game like that. And Fernandez was another guy, undersized, probably about 249, 252, maybe at the most, 6 feet, maybe but unstoppable.
Yeah.
Jake Scott is another really underrated but great player. He was back there and they're helping to run the secondary, which didn't have that much to do because the passing game was so stymied, but he would come downhill and smack you around.
All the no-name Dolphins.
Right. And Bonacani's the only one in the Hall of Fame.
He's the only one. That is unbelievable.
It is unbelievable.
How Manny Fernandez wasn't, I don't know. Just because his career ended up being shorter, but hey.
Yeah, that's why.
Terrell Davis had a very short career as a running back, yet he gets in. So
I would love to see the seniors committee at some point, at least, give better consideration to Manny Fernandez. That he was such a great player, short career or not. Nobody could block. You couldn't single block him ever. And even double teams, he would, sometimes blast through or push them back, despite being a smaller guy.
Exactly. And then, of course, they come back and win it again the next year by beating the Vikings yet again, 24-7. This one was just this was not even. This was the first game that I have ever called a Super Bowl.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, the Dolphins were so dominant in that game. The Vikings didn't have a prayer, not a prayer. And Fran Tarkenton gets criticized and all this other jazz. Yes, he was a great scrambler, but against that no-name defense, he was just stymied. They were absolutely stymied.
It wouldn't have mattered to some extent what he did because I mean, they're once again, their running game was utterly dismantled right before their very eyes. And they had, good running backs, they had good wide receivers, but you couldn't hold up. You just couldn't, right?
Nope.
You couldn't hold up. And once again, Manny Fernandez, and that bunch were just he's unblockable. Once again, and that terrific, right? We talk about the purple people eaters, but they were once again an undersized group, and you just saw them get thrown around.
Absolutely.
You almost began to feel for them, right? They built everything around speed and quickness and penetration. And when somebody gets their hands on you and everything you do is around speed and quickness and penetration, you're getting these bigger, stronger bodies just crashing into you and throwing you around. And so once again, running game and defense. And the Vikings weren't able to get anything going as a running game. Their defense got, frankly, pummeled. And, Fran Tarkenton could have been, name a quarterback. It wouldn't have mattered who it was. You could have been a combination of Tom Brady, Fran Tarkenton, Dan Marino. It wouldn't have mattered.
Wouldn't have mattered. You were getting destroyed.
Well,
and of course the Dolphins run ends because the World Football League comes into play, and Jim Kick and Zonka both leave for the World Football League.
Warfield too, right?
Warfield left for the World Football League as well. And then I don't know. Do we have to discuss that next 1975? I don't want to talk about that game.
We can move quickly through that one.
Okay.
So no, I'll very briefly mention my sort of origin story.
Yeah, this is the first time that the Pittsburgh Steelers are in the Super Bowl, and yes, they played the Vikings, and of course, it was 16-6. The Steel Curtain basically had their way with, again, the Minnesota offense. And again, that smaller defense just could not stop.
Webster and Kolb. And the thing that jumps out at you once again is just the power dynamic, right? There's nothing subtle about the Pittsburgh Steelers on either side of the football. They are a power team on both sides.
Yeah.
Later, they would become a really good passing offense, but they weren't yet. That hadn't happened yet. They would throw the occasional deep shot off play action, but they were not a truly effective, efficient passing offense yet. No. That was another year or two down the road.
This is not one of Terry Bradshaw's 300-yard passing games, of which he only had 7 in his entire career.
Right.
And 3 of them happened in Super Bowls.
Super Bowls, right. Once again, like we talk about Eli Manning, his best when his best was needed.
Yeah.
But he's a passenger for this one. And he would admit as much. Yeah. That defense, the linebackers are smothering. Once again, we talked about the run fits. Maybe not quite the shutout that I talked about of the earlier run fits, but this is maybe the second best.
Absolutely.
Just fitting up the run like you wouldn't believe. And stopping guys with 0, 2, 1, -3. And once again, this is a really good running attack. This is once again, all teams in those days built around the run, and then you threw off of that. And, so you can blame whoever you want to blame, but it's all about line play. And that line just got dominated. That great offensive line, right? With, Page and Eller, Hall of Famers, and Marshall, who probably should be in the Hall of Fame, right? 2 Hall of Famers and 1 should be Hall of Famer. And they got just dominated.
Yeah. And then the next season, yes. There they are in Miami playing the Cowboys. And it was 21-17 for the Steelers. It was just more of the same. The Steel Curtain, and Doomsday played well that day as well.
Yep.
Both defenses played very well. But again, the Steelers came out victorious, and that was a very bad day for me, because that was the 3rd time I'd seen the Dallas Cowboys lose a Super Bowl game.
So we've been throwing garlands at the feet of defensive linemen, especially defensive tackles, and it's now time to give a little love to one Joseph Green. Mean Joe Green, who was
Dean
going up against a
Jones.
great offensive line,
Yeah.
could not be contained. He was, and they slanted him, right?
Yeah.
And so he's this, once again, a guy who could play in any era. 6'4", 290 plus, probably, but at least 290. And incredibly powerful, incredibly quick. And so when you think about a guy like Ndamukong Suh, think about a more athletic, longer armed version of Ndamukong Suh, and that'll give you an idea of what Mean Joe Green was like. He was so athletic and so powerful with long arms. So he could literally hold one offensive lineman off with one arm and grab a running back, and he often did with the other. That was kind of a Mean Joe Green thing, right? Was to kind of use this long, powerful arm to just stop pulling guard or stop a center or just stop in their tracks, like stop them, like the same way that you would, like hitting somebody in the forehead with a hammer would stop them. Boom. And then just grab a 230-pound running back or grab, like once again, like it was nothing, right? And just snatch it to his chest. And he was a good pass rusher too, but you earned pass rushing by stopping the run. He was one of the great run-stopping defensive tackles of all time. The linebackers played well, but this to me was also about the fact that secondary of the Steelers, when finally Dallas was forced to try to throw the ball, utterly blanketed, right?
Yeah.
Utterly blanketed. And once again, this is prior to the Mel Blount rule, prior to the illegal contact rule. So you would bump and run. If you had great defensive backs, and they had great defensive backs, they would just bump and run all over the field. And they couldn't get away, right? You just couldn't, there was no place for you to go. I can't, was Lance Allworth still with, no, or he retired?
He had retired.
He retired. So it was Renzel. It was Renzel. It was Peter Gint. It was who later went on to write North Dallas 40.
And Drew Pearson.
Drew Pearson. And they could not get free to save their lives.
No.
They were basically in a straitjacket the whole game. So once they stopped the run and then Dallas was forced to pass, well, first of all, that's how most games, right? You force a team to pass. That usually means that they're done, especially in those days. And against that secondary with that pass rush, not a recipe for success. So that was a great defensive performance as well.
And then the Minnesota Vikings made their fourth Super Bowl and final Super Bowl. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, Steve. You've never seen your team in the Super Bowl, you young fella. Yes, we both have. But this was total domination yet again because the Oakland Raiders of John Madden, they just beat up again on the Vikings, 32-14.
Yeah. So Gene Upshaw, rightfully is a Hall of Famer. He may never have had a better game, though. Oh my God. Oh my God.
He was such a nightmare.
Oh my God. Gene Upshaw. So there's a modern term. You say someone got thrown out of the club. Well, once again, as I mentioned, Alan Page is a Hall of Famer, and rightfully so. But he got thrown out of the club on multiple occasions.
He was on his back. He was on his back more times than you would care to see anybody on their back who was a defensive lineman.
Art Shell and Gene Upshaw. I mean, the whole offensive line was amazing. 3, Hall of Famers on that offensive line, but Gene Upshaw was as great as everybody was. Gene Upshaw was unstoppable. Yeah. I wish somebody just they didn't have GoPros yet, but I wish somebody strapped a camera to him so you could just watch him. Take big, strong, powerful men and just wash them away like a tsunami would wash away.
He was the version of what we talk about pancaking a defensive lineman. He pancaked everybody that went up against him that day. And Alan Page wasn't the only victim.
No, everybody could get smoked.
Jim Eller got hit. They all got smoked that day.
Larson, all of them. Yes, and a few unlucky linebackers got to eat a face full of him. Sorry, Scott Studwell. Yeah, it was who I think might have been defensive rookie of the year.
I think so. I think he might have been.
I know early in his career, but from I think Cal Lutheran, if memory serves me correctly. But just all of them, just Seaman, Mike Seaman was the other. Mike Seaman and Matt Blair. They had a great linebacker core.
Oh yeah.
Not that it mattered, but
and again, what people need to understand is that this is the day of 4-3 defenses. You didn't see the linebackers lead the field the way that you do now because the defenses weren't being played like they do now, where it's two linebackers a lot. Well, it was basically.
Yeah, and I talked about Bobby Bell. Matt Blair was essentially, I wouldn't say poor man's. He was like a working class version, a blue collar, working class version of Bobby Bell. He was legitimately 6'4" and probably about a half, probably about 238 pounds, 240 maybe, but could run like a deer. Now they didn't keep a lot of the records, but he still, I think, holds records for combined blocked place kicks between field goals and PATs. I think he still holds the all-time record.
Yeah.
He was a magnificent athlete.
Which means he has more than Ed Jones did, who had a lot of in his own career as well.
More than anybody.
Yeah.
Anybody. And he would be, once again, even better now, right? Because he played Sam and he would put his hand in the dirt and rush the passer only on third down. And only sometimes even on third down. But nowadays, he would rush the passer more, and he would be a guy who would end up with probably 70 career sacks because you throw the ball so much more. Now he'd have more opportunities, and he would bat down probably 7 passes a year, which I don't think he even kept as a stat in those days. I mean, his value would be higher now because he could cover too. With all that size, he was tremendously athletic. He could turn and run with whatever tight end you wanted to name. Just a beautiful athlete. It had like a 31-inch waist. He was a ridiculous athlete. Yeah. He looked like a superhero. But once again, didn't matter that game. Everyone just got washed away. And the thing that stuck with me, other than once again just Gene Upshaw being the most dominant player, one of the most dominant performances I've ever seen in a Super Bowl, was. You got to see young John Madden, obviously. You got to see, this young upstart sort of. I mean, everything about the Raiders was like sneering and insouciant, and like everything.
They had a left-handed quarterback who also came from the University of Alabama, like Joe Willie Namath did, in Kenny the Snake Stabler.
Right, and once again, we talked about, speaking of Alabama quarterbacks, about how Namath was that his most game managerial. Same thing for Stabler, right? A guy who was known as a gambler and a deep shot artist, kept it very much under control. Just kept the truck out of the ditch, basically.
Oh, absolutely.
Controlled, boring passing, not the bombs away attack we came to expect from the Raiders.
Yeah. And then, of course, the next season is another season minus the Steelers in a Super Bowl, which is very happy for me. Because for the first time, the Louisiana Superdome hosts the Super Bowl, and the Craig Morton, former Cowboys quarterback, led the Denver Broncos, and I'm sorry, they just got destroyed by the Cowboys, 27-10. That was another one of those Super Bowl games that we've had. The Cowboys did not run up the score; they could have. They could have. But Doomsday defense was just all over the Broncos. I mean, it was Randy White, Ed Jones, and Harvey Martin. They were just absolute nightmares. Absolute nightmares.
And Harvey Martin, should be in the Hall of Fame as well. But the two good defenses met. The Orange Crush got a little bit crushed themselves. That was another defense that was built around mobility.
Yeah.
And they didn't have a lot of big guys on their defense. They had one sort of, once again, Alzado, right? Another guy who probably should get more Hall of Fame consideration. Alzado was on that team from Yankton, right? Yankton, South Dakota.
A
guy who I don't think he ever played at a 4-year. I think he went straight from junior college. But You had, some Foley and a few of those guys in the secondary. They had one of the greatest linebackers of all time who finally made the Hall of Fame, which bothered me how long it took him. Once again, I guess the 10-year career thing bothers people, but Randy Gradishar, who was a beyond good linebacker.
Yeah.
But the Orange Crush didn't have just the beef to sort of hold up against that offensive line. And then on offense, they didn't have a very dynamic offense, right?
No.
Morton had a big arm, but they didn't
Yeah.
throw the ball deep that often. And they had a good tight end. They had good tight ends. They had, a ball control passing attack, despite the strong arm that Morton had. And once they weren't able to run the football, well, that was basically it. Right?
That game was over, and it was over pretty quickly. It really
pretty
was.
quickly. It was over pretty quickly, right? I would say, yeah. By the time you got to the second quarter, you got a feeling that the Denver Broncos were not going to be able to come up with a solution. And Red Miller, who once again was a defensive-minded coach,
Yep.
Once his defense wasn't able to hold up, didn't have, there was no plan B. There was no. What we're going to do now is, once you couldn't stop, Tony Dorsett is sort of the picture of, people think of that. I guess he's the most glamorous member of that version of the offense, but he wasn't, to me, the deciding factor. Though he had a good game, it was the power, right? When they handed the ball to the fullbacks a little more than they did some other games, and they all did well.
Yep.
And then their own ball control throwing. I mean, they weren't throwing because they had to, right? They were throwing because they wanted to. You would load the box, right, to try to hold up against that run, and then, right, a little 6, 7, 8 yard pass, and now it's 2nd and 2, and now they run the ball down your throat. So long, sustained drives,
and it was, yeah. I mean, that game was pretty much over, and then of course we have the Steel Curtain and the Doomsday Defense, who end up in a very high-scoring game, 35-31. And I was like, where was either defense this day? Where were they? I mean, they were just not there. Neither one of them.
That game felt. All the games we've talked about to this point all had a similar feel to them, right?
Yep.
The team that stops the run and runs the ball better wins. Boom. End of story, right? Sort of very quick, easy explanation of who wins. And then we have this game, which is so different from all the other Super Bowls we've talked about. The offensive lines both showed up. The wide receivers showed out, right? I mean, tremendous wide receiver play. And obviously, if there's a game that got Lynn Swann into the Hall of Fame, it's probably this one. Lynn Swann did things that, frankly, very few wide receivers have ever done, ever. His body control and speed and leaping ability were all on. And this is a very good secondary, right? He's going up against a couple of Hall of Famers and maybe one or two other guys who should be in the Hall of Fame. I mean, Harrison Waters and, the whole Everson Walls, who probably should be in the Hall of Fame. It's a tremendous group back there that he's going up against. Now, the one thing they didn't have was speed. That was the one thing they didn't have. They had these really smart guys who played these really, really intelligent mostly zone, some matchup sort of principles sometimes. They would jump into man very rarely, sometimes in their blitzing or sometimes a few other times sort of as a changeup. But because they lack speed, they rarely did it. But one of the first things they teach you as a defensive back is at some point zone turns into man, right? If the play goes on long enough, at some point zone turns into man. And that's where the Cowboys defense, when the rush wasn't getting there, and Bradshaw by this time was a very proficient passer, especially of the deep ball. Maybe the best in the league at that point, in the late 70s.
And Mr. Stallworth was the recipient of those longer passes. Lynn Swann didn't do his damage deep. He was the guy that was the intermediate threat.
Yep.
And when you saw him go up in the air on that one, and the leaping ability, oh my Lord.
Yep.
And then of course in the second half, Jackie Smith, the tight end for the Cowboys, dropped, and I mean he just no. How did that happen?
It's one of maybe two things that have kept Jackie Smith out of the Hall of Fame, and neither of them should have kept him out. If those are the things they're keeping him out of the Hall of Fame, they should not. Jackie Smith was a Hall of Fame tight end. He was a good enough blocker for his era. He'd be a very good blocker nowadays, but for his era, he was a good enough blocker, but a tremendous receiver. Just a tremendous. He could run routes and catch.
I think he had only had 2 drop passes before that in his career.
Right. Ironically, he was known for having some of the best hands in the league. It is unfair that this is what he's so much remembered for because he was such a great player. Yeah. Staubach had a great game. Staubach had a great game. Did he make 1 or 2 mistakes? Sure. But for the most part, he played really well. But this game ended up being about the secondary play, right? And unlike all the other games we've talked about where the secondary is sort of been along for the ride, they are determinate in this game. And the Pittsburgh secondary outplayed the Dallas secondary. There were just more big plays to be had down the field by the Steelers than by Dallas. And Dallas had some too. I want to make it clear. Dallas got Butch Johnson and once again Drew Pearson got some of theirs too. But they were not able to do it quite as consistently. No. And so unlike all these other Super Bowls where it's run the ball and play defense,
this was the first time that the passing game really was shown in a Super Bowl.
Yep. It was the first time a passing game decided a Super Bowl.
Yep.
Definitely.
Yeah. And then of course the next season George Lopez's Rams upset the Cowboys, which really, really annoyed me. But your Steelers destroyed the Rams 31-19.
The Rams were one of the most unusual Super Bowl teams, right? Because when I look back at them, you talked about like Denver or whatever, and there have been some other sort of surprise Super Bowl teams. And, you talked about even the Over the Hill gang. But like I remember that Rams team, and I remember being shocked that they were in the Super Bowl. They just didn't seem to be that good. And I don't mean to say that to be unpleasant or mean or whatever, but their running game was all right. Lawrence McCutcheon was an above average running back, but nothing spectacular. Their receivers were NFL wide receivers, but none of them really stood out to me. Their tight ends, I think Mike Gooman might have been one of them, but nothing jumped out at you. Their offensive, they did have one truly great offensive lineman. They had one truly great offensive lineman, and some other good offensive linemen. On defense, they had Jack Youngblood, who was really, really good. I mean, they had Jack and Jim Youngblood, who were one linebacker, one defensive lineman, and one who's in the Hall of Fame, and one who's in the Hall of Very Good. Fred Dreyer's in the Hall of Very Good. Their secondary,
but their quarterback was a former CFL guy who I had watched get destroyed by the Edmonton Eskimos, Vince Ferragamo. And he just, I don't know, he just had this little bit of a run here, and that's basically what got them into the Super Bowl that year. Yep. But again, the steel curtain, they lit up that day. It was.
I remember that being L.C. Greenwood's game.
L.C. Greenwood game. Yeah. You got it.
L.C. Greenwood
and Jack Ham and Jack Ham as well.
Ham had a great game too, but I remember it seems like L.C. Greenwood hit Vince Ferragamo about 15 different times. Yeah. I think he had about 3.5 sacks, and then hit him about another dozen times. They seem to have literally no answer for him. And once again, Mean Joe Green is still Mean Joe Green, but they had clearly planned for him. Yeah. So they had, 2 and 3 people trying to, handle him, and he was still getting pressure.
Joe. Yeah.
Yeah, he's still getting pressure, but L.C. Greenwood just feasted.
He was all over the Rams that day.
Yep. Absolutely. He blew up a couple of running plays in the backfield and just was hitting Vince Ferragamo mercilessly all day, it seemed like.
It was nasty. It was definitely nasty. And then the Fly Eagles Fly crowd finally make a Super Bowl under Dick Vermeil.
Yep. Young Dick Vermeil.
Young Dick Vermeil, yes, who had already done his thing at UCLA by this point, and
Yep.
But the Eagles just didn't have anything to face the Oakland Raiders with. They just didn't have enough.
Well, a lot of what we just talked about in terms of just bully ball, right? The Eagles once again had a defense that was based on movement and speed. They had a lot of really good but quick players on defense. Young Herman Edwards, right back there, along with what was the other one? They had two Outlaw, right? Outlaw and Outlaw and Edwards, and once again really smart. Not super athletic, but smart corners. They had, I think Berge was still there as one of their linebackers. They had some good players on defense, but none of them were. I mean, once again, we talked about Steel Curtin. We talked about guys like Joe Green. They didn't have anybody like that. They didn't have anybody vaguely like that. And so when that just big, strong, powerful Oakland line just physically moving them, and then on the other side of the ball, once again, it's that Gilman-based offense, right? Vermeil had learned the Gilman offense, and it's built around, though people think of Gilman as this wild, passing innovator, they really wanted to run the ball. And Wilbert Montgomery, first ballot Hall of Very Good running back. Everything came off of him, right? And
exactly.
He also could really catch the ball. He was a great all-around.
He was a great receiving running back. He was a great receiving back. Yeah.
Great all-around little running back. Like I said, first ballot Hall of Very Good. But they couldn't get him going. And their passing game was built around the tight end a lot. They had a very good tight end. And their receivers, I mean, just finally made the Hall of Fame a couple years ago. Giant from Jackson State. 6'8". Harold Carmichael.
Harold Carmichael. There it is.
They had Harold Carmichael, who, for his size, was reasonably athletic, but his main thing was just sort of going up over people. The problem is that, once again, if you tie him up, right, it takes him a while to get going. And so if you slow him down, by the time he uncoils, your quarterback's laying on the ground. And so that was, Jaworski, was a tough guy. You got to show off his toughness because he got whacked around pretty good. Villapiano and that bunch, they blitzed him a fair amount, and they had trouble picking up the blitzes, and then they covered on the back end. I mean, they had some tremendous speaking. I mean, Mike Haynes pitched some shutouts that year. I mean, literal shutouts, right? You couldn't get anything done against him. They just had a great secondary. Obviously, Tatum is a guy that some people believe should be in the Hall of Fame. He's certainly at least a borderline Hall of Famer. Atkinson was the fastest safety in football.
Easy. And it was the return of Jim Plunkett, who had been basically left for dead because he was drafted by the Boston Patriots.
Right. And then the 49ers and gets beaten up even worse.
It gets beat up even more because at that point in time, the Niners were a horrible franchise as well. And then he comes to Oakland and he leads that team to the Super Bowl. That was a wonderful team. And then the first of 4 straight winning Super Bowls for Mr. Joe Montana and the San Francisco 49ers. And they were just dynamite. Bottom line, dynamite.
Yep. And once again, a defense built around speed and motion and movement, but did not get pushed around.
No.
They had a lot of small, fast defenders. And I at this point, I'd be conditioned to think that was trouble. Like, okay, eventually that somebody's going to catch up with them and swat them, right? Like I'd seen happen to the Vikings, like I'd seen happen to the Eagles. Well, it didn't happen to them, right? To their credit, despite being a small, fast defense with, tremendous. Carlton Williamson, and of course Ronnie Lott, who is in the Hall of Fame, but everybody back there is at least Hall of Very Good. One of the best total secondaries. Once again, up there with those we just talked about, the Steelers had a great secondary, and of course, obviously the Doomsday defense, great secondary. But this is one of the great secondaries I've ever seen. All of those guys, young too. This was the young 49ers, right? They're all the
Very,
guys.
very young.
Almost all the guys in their first 3 or 4 years in the league.
Yeah.
They're. This is no one has an answer yet for the West Coast offense. They're just picking everyone apart, and we all remember the game where they, put an end to the Cowboys dynasty. And the thing about it is, they're seeing somebody who does some of the same things that Staubach does, right? But the difference is that there's more answers to the test, right? There's more outlets. There's more places to go with the football. Staubach usually had, deep short, right? You have a deep option, a short option, and then take off, right? Run, Roger.
But this West Coast offense was something different because you had a guy short, intermediate, long.
You always had 3 options
every
to go
play,
with the ball.
every single play.
Yep.
And
so no matter what happens, you've got somewhere to go with the football usually.
Yeah.
And you combine that with Montana's quick arm and quick thinking. He didn't have a big arm, not a terribly strong arm, but very quick.
No, very quick.
Smart guy, could avoid pressure long enough to get the ball out. And he was perfect. He was the perfect quarterback for that offense. You combine that with receivers who got open instantaneously. And once again, we now have the Mel Blount rule. We now have the illegal contact rule. So
Bingo.
You can't ride them right down the field.
Yeah. And then of course, the next 2 seasons were just awful for this Cowboys fan because Joe Gibbs was around. And Joe Gibbs goes into the Rose Bowl and they defeat the Miami Dolphins 27-17 with Dan Marino at quarterback.
Yep. Despite all the stuff about quarterback-driven league and whatever.
Oh no, this wasn't Marino. This is the
it's Woodley.
This Woodley. Sorry, Woodley. Sorry.
The pride of LSU, right?
Exactly. A former Bengal.
Yes, and this is probably what convinces Shula he needs to move on from Woodley. He struggles mightily in that game.
He struggled mightily, and of course, this was a game where Mr. Riggins showed up.
Yeah.
161 yards on the ground and all that fun sort of stuff. But then the next and go ahead.
Obviously, he was a rare athlete, right? He at one point held the Kansas State long jump record, and he broke a Gale Sayers record. I mean, Gale Sayers, who's a very different kind of freak athlete, but Riggins, at a 220-pound high school guy, is a 20-plus foot long jumper, which such a kind of athlete he was, and has an early great start to his career with the Jets and becomes persona non grata because he's basically too much of a weirdo, and just a real iconoclast, and that rubbed them the wrong way. And one of the things about Gibbs is he didn't coach everyone the same way, right?
No.
Some people say, "Oh, I treat everybody the same," but no, Gibbs did. He would coach guys who needed hard coaching. He would coach them hard. Guys who needed an easy hand, he would have an easier hand with. But this is it's a team that's constructed somewhat differently from the Over the Hill gang, but it's still kind of a mishmash, right? Yeah. It's some of the guys he found there and he decided not to get rid of, but he turned over a lot of the guys from the roster. When he first gets there,
that's right.
George Allen, once again, is a guy who does not believe in the draft, as we talked about. So it's an old roster, right? When Gibbs first gets there, and he's like, "Oh, this won't do," and he begins trading away and moving on from some of these older guys, and some of them just retiring, and then building through the draft. And it takes a couple of years, right? Because that's what
exactly
build through the draft. But he starts drafting offensive linemen, and he gets some guys via trade or via free agency, but he builds that quote unquote Hogs offensive lineman, and Mark May and Bostic,
Mark Grimm, all these guys that I can't stomach. I don't want to talk about those Hogs and their fans, especially with their snouts on their nose and no, that was just horrifying. It was,
and then
horrible.
He adds to it to further. He adds the 2 tight ends thing too, right? So now you've got 2 tight ends, one of whom's a fierce, vicious blocker, one of whom's an okay blocker, but both can catch the ball well enough. And you combine that with Riggins, who is this basically like Zonka but faster, right? So he's that guy.
As I said to Ryan and Joe the other day, last week when I posted a picture of Riggins in this Super Bowl, I said this man was a beast of a running back long before there was ever a Marshawn Lynch. And this is what John Riggins really was. He was a beast. He was a beast.
Yeah, his career numbers are impressive, but basically he was internal exile for 3 years with the Jets. If not for that, his records would be even more impressive because his power and speed combination and behind that offensive line, right? Oof. I mean, they would take games.
That Super Bowl really annoyed me because my mom was watching Good Morning America and the weather guy on Good Morning America, Steve Bell or something, Steve Johnson at that time, whatever his name was. He said that Washington was going to win this game 20 by the score. He had it. And so my mom at the Super Bowl party picked those numbers, and she won a lot of money that year.
Wow.
Yeah, 27-17. She got it. She got it all. I think she also had the halftime score as well. I mean, she was just all over that thing that day. But then again, the very next year, Mr. Gibbs got taught a lesson. I mean, a lesson. And this was the Los Angeles Raiders at this point.
Yes.
Yes, it was. Who destroyed the Redskins 38-9. And it was horrifying to my mother that year. And well, that didn't hurt my feelings at all. It was a beautiful sight as far as I was concerned.
And the pride of Lincoln High School. Yeah, the pride of Lincoln High School.
And again, this goes into the Super Bowl era, as I refer to it as.
Yep.
Because the next year, Mr. Montana and company, 38-16 against Dan Marino. So Marino made his one Super Bowl appearance, it was not pretty. The Niners just destroyed them. And it was basically a home game for San Francisco because the game was played at Stanford Stadium.
Right.
Basically a home game. And then we had the Bears.
For a brief and shining moment.
Yes.
Now we talked about defenses, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And ironically, right, the 46 defense is based around that covering, right? The center and the two guards covering them.
The two guards. Yeah.
And then basically saying we're going to play defense with three guys in the secondary and be in an 8-man front pretty much all the time and dare you to throw the football. And can you get the ball out before Richard Dent or Dan Hampton or somebody is lying, or Steve McMichael or somebody is lying on top of your quarterback? And more often than not, they could not get that happen. Leslie Frazier was on that team, but unfortunately was hurt, so he got a ring, but he didn't get a chance to play.
Yeah.
But they had Todd Bell and Sean Gale and Gary Finzik and Doug Plank. I mean, once again, none of those guys were great in coverage, but they all would hit you very hard. Very, very hard. And when you combine that with Mike Singletary and, I mean, they just had a great ability to take away everything you wanted to do. Obviously, stop the run first. They were great at stopping the run. And then once they'd taken away your run game, they would get that pass rush going. And that it was, one of the probably 5 or 6 greatest pass rushes in the history of the NFL was that one, right? It was, I mean, and you had Wilbur Marshall. So if you did manage to get a pass out to a running back or tight end, there's Wilbur Marshall, bam,
Bam. Your history. Or even Singletary. I mean, they were both there.
Could cover too. Yeah, could cover too.
And they could just put you to the ground very, very harshly, and of course that is also the Patriots' first of 5 Super Bowl losses.
Yep. Which is a record, right?
Which is a record. Who are they tied with for the Super Bowl losses? Another AFC team.
Hold on.
The
I know that.
Denver Broncos.
Broncos. That's right. Because they lost three
Yep.
under. Yeah, they lost one under Red Miller and three under Dan Reeves.
Yep.
And they lost.
then-
They lost the one to the Seattle Seahawks when Peyton was
Right.
there. And
Exactly. And of course, the next season is Mr. Parcells and his New York Giants destroying the Broncos 39-20. And then of course the Broncos come back again, and they lose to the Redskins.
Right. And it's the 46-10.
Yeah.
And it's Doug Williams, and it's
42-10.
42. And initially, right, Denver's looking great at first. They get out,
Yep.
they look like they've got it all going. They've got their Three Musketeers thing with Vance Johnson and Ricky Nattiel and the third one. But I mean, these little, quick, explosive little receivers, and their running game is not, the later, zone stuff that we have.
Isn't it Rick Upchurch?
Right. They have Rick Upchurch up there, but they've got this dynamic offense, right? With John Albert Elway Jr., pulling the trigger. He's got the cannon for an arm, but he's also, a bit of a wild card. He throws interceptions, and
he was very wild at that point.
At that point in his career, right? He threw a lot of interceptions. But the main thing for me, once again, the offensive line play, and Doug Williams, after he misses a few, he comes out with the knee injury, he sprains the knee slightly, and he realizes he's never going to get a chance probably to do this. They put a rubber sleeve on it, the hot pack, a cold pack, whatever pack it was, and then he says, "I'm going back out there." He trots back out there with a little bit of a hitch in his giddy up and just starts. I mean, this is, they have still that power running attack, but he just is slinging the rock. And he's another guy that has thrown a lot of interceptions in his career, but not that day. He is on target.
Yeah.
And he was a great deep ball thrower when he's on, and he was on that day. And so
they were just spoke. And then again, the very next year, they faced Washington, and they get they faced Washington 42-10. The next year, we get a much closer version of the San Francisco 49ers versus Cincinnati Bengals. But again, that Niners team was just so damn good.
It was 20-16. It was the only really, really close Super Bowl for the dynasty 49ers. And lost in it is how well Ken Anderson played. That both defenses played well. People forget how good that 49ers defense was. Ken Anderson was great, not good, great that year. Set records that year, had a fantastic year. And his record that he set that year stood until for completion percentage, until Drew Brees breaks it many years later, when the game is a very different game. So
very
different
game,
him completing, at 70.4, I think, or something like that, 70 point. It's a ludicrous number for that era.
And he is another man that belongs in Canton, Ohio, who has not been voted in yet. It's just a shame because Kenny Anderson was a fantastic quarterback, and he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame.
I think Kenny is in now. I think he finally got in.
Kenny Anderson is still not in. No.
Oh, that's wrong. He should be in.
Yeah.
They got Kenny Riley in after, frankly, too late. Get Kenny Anderson in too. Ken Anderson was a magnet. He was the only quarterback in the in our division during that dynastic run that scared me. Right? Kenny Anderson scared me. He would scare me in a way more than we would face like people like Stabler. And Stabler, as good as he was, would give you the ball, right? He would give you opportunities to get interceptions. Anderson rarely put the ball in jeopardy, so we wouldn't even get a chance to get some nice interceptions from him. So accurate, so smart.
Oh, he was just phenomenal.
That was a great Super Bowl, and the Bengals are a play or two from winning that game. And it's sort of lost in the greatness of Montana and the 49ers. how great a performance that was by that Bengals team.
And then of course, the Niners end off their little stretch here by destroying the Broncos 55-10. I mean, that was just another super bore of a game. It was over and done with very early. And then the rest of the 90s here, there was a certain team in Buffalo that they went to the Super Bowl 4 straight times, and they lose 4 straight times to the NFC East teams. So we're going to discuss the first one, 20-19. The New York Giants beat the Bills. And we know what happened in that game. Why, you know, what was it? Wide? It was wide left, wasn't it?
Wide left. Yeah, I'm trying to remember which one it was. It was wide left. So shout out to some of my old high school teammates, Matt Darby, and also shout out to Keith Goganis, who got drafted by the Bills and got to a few of those Super Bowls with the Bills. The Bills, Henry Jones, who I got a chance to work with when I was a graduate assistant at University of Illinois, also was on several of those teams. They were, once again, it gets lost how good those teams were in their unfortunate destiny, but those were terrific teams. The K-gun offense, which is sort of ahead of its time, it's they're running that sugar huddle or that muddle huddle or whatever we call it, where they're going up tempo, they're calling a lot of their offense at the line of scrimmage. The slot receiver is very often the leading receiver, which that was a new thing at the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Slot receivers prior to that, and slot backs, as they were called, as you and I both remember back in the 60s and 70s.
Exactly.
Were sort of like tweener guys. You didn't quite know what to do with. You want to get them on the field, but they weren't dominant.
They were nowhere near as explosive as today's
dominant, right? They weren't guys that you built your offense or ran your offense through, and they had a really nice offense, right? I mean, Andre Reed, fantastic. Lofton, fantastic. I mean, they had good tight ends. They have Thurman Thomas, who's once again a great all-around running back. Can catch the ball, can pick up blitzes. What couldn't he do? Yeah. And like I said, Jim Kelly, who had a cannon for an arm, and I mean, he and Elway were very similar guys. He was very similar, almost as athletic, not quite as athletic as Elway, and similar, almost maybe not quite as strong an arm, but almost as strong an arm. And on defense, they were solid. Cornelius Bennett, who's a Hall of Very Good first ballot guy. Shout out once again to my hometown area, Norfolk, Virginia's own Bruce Smith, who went to Washington High School. Got to watch him dismantle when I was on junior varsity, dismantle the varsity at Lake Taylor High School. But once again, the thing that decided was that offensive line, right? That Larry Allen and just 2-A and just truly one of the great offensive lines. Yeah.
And then the next year, it's the Redskins beating them 37-24. It's the last time that I've had to see the burgundy and gold ever touch the Super Bowl, which does not hurt my feelings.
With their third different quarterback, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So they made it there with Theismann. They made it there with, of course, Doug Williams, who wasn't the starter. Jay Schrader started that year.
Jay Schrader was the starter. Yeah.
He gave way to Doug Williams, who became a Super Bowl MVP, and then now we have Mark Rippon, a mid-round draft pick from Washington State that a lot of teams didn't think that highly of. He had a strong arm, but he had sort of slow feet, and it took him a while to really catch up with the game. He was a guy that,
but he was fantastic that year. He was fantastic.
Yep.
And then of course the return of the Dallas Cowboys to the Super Bowl under Jimmy Johnson, and they crushed the Bills 52-17.
Yeah, that was
and
hard watch.
And of course, as Mr. Julio here says, how about Leon Lett getting the premature TD celebration? Yes, the Cowboys should have had the record score in a Super Bowl. But of course,
Leon, shout out to Steve Tasker for never giving up on it.
He didn't give up on that. He did not give up on that.
Yep.
And Julio also asks us, how tough was Larry Allen. The landlord is the biggest, strongest SOB I have ever seen in my life. I don't care what any offensive lineman today says. Larry Allen would have beaten you up. He would have beaten you up.
So I've seen Larry Allen, bench press 100 pounds.
Exactly.
He was ludicrously strong. He would bench press what strong men squat, and he would squat, basically a room full of furniture. His sheer power, right? And you add it to the fact he was a pretty good athlete on top of it. Played some tackle in a pinch, but obviously was one of the great guards in the history of the game. His pure raw power. He would just make contact with guys, and they would go like like an earthquake, right? Like something had torn the ground up from underneath their feet. His power was unthinkable. His ability to just redirect people.
Yeah, he could destroy anybody that he was ever up against, and quite often he had two defensive guys coming at him. I mean, they were trying to get one of them loose, and neither one of them could get loose. I mean, he was just dynamite. Of course, this is the last NFL team as well that had the number one defense in the NFL and the leading running back in Emmitt Smith. That's also going to happen again tomorrow, kids, because Saquon Barkley and the number one defense is going to be playing Patrick Mahomes. But again, Darren Woodson was spectacular. How Darren again? Here we go again.
Guy deserves more Hall of Fame consideration. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, how Eric Allen was a good guy. Yes, he was a good player, but he does not have the same credentials as Darren Woodson. I'm sorry, he just doesn't, and he's so much better than John Lynch ever was.
That's the one that bothers me more. Eric Allen, I have no trouble being the Hall of Fame.
No,
John Lynch.
But again, Eric Allen was the longest guy on this list. Now Darren Woodson is. So hopefully next year Mr. Woodson gets in.
Yeah, hopefully Woodson gets in. He's a deserving candidate. And once again, just looking at that team, that still once again that historic offensive line that just brutalizes people. Troy Aikman, who does enough in the passing game. They have Jay Novacek, who's a terrific receiving tight end who can also block. They have good wide receivers. Allen Harper is that great jump ball artist. And, of course, the playmaker, Michael Irvin. They have one of the great running backs of the era. They have a great defense to go with it. And I think was Charles Haley moved around a lot. Was he on that team?
Yeah.
Okay, I thought so. And then in Charles Haley, they were one of the great pass rushers of that era. Dion was a 49er.
He was only a Cowboy in 95.
95. Okay, so right. So he's back with the 49ers, I think, by that point.
Yeah.
He moved around a lot too. But yeah.
And then again, the fourth game of the Bills losing in a row was 30-13. Again, it wasn't a close game. So these things happen. And then, of course, Jimmy Johnson decides to leave Dallas thanks to the owner. Yes. What's that guy's name? That old guy? I can't remember his name. And of course, the 49ers go to the Super Bowl again and destroy the San Diego Chargers 49-26. Again, this was a super bore of a game. It was horrifying to watch, especially being a Cowboys fan, to see the Niners win another Super Bowl. It really sucked.
That game could have been even worse than it was. And Steve Young still, I mean, I have a hard time thinking of more impressive passing performances. He's got to have one of the top 4 or 5 passing performances in the history
in a Super Bowl. Yeah. Yep.
He's unstoppable in that.
But
Roger Craig is good. Lots of people are good.
They also had the best receiver of all time in Jerry Rice, and that was the penultimate thing in that game. But let's talk about my favorite Super Bowl. Super Bowl 30 in Tempe, Arizona. The Cowboys beat the Steelers. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The only two teams who have played each other 3 times in a Super Bowl, by the way, are the Steelers and the Cowboys.
Correct.
And of course, this was the penultimate title for the Cowboys. It's the last one they've won and all that jazz. It was the last Super Bowl game that I went to as well, by the way.
Huh.
Yeah, cost me $210 for a ticket that day.
Oh my!
And 210. I was in the Marine Corps at the time. $210 was pretty pricey, but hey, you know, you pay the price. You pay the price. But again, it was just a masterful performance from the Cowboys, who they dominated Pittsburgh that game. Bottom line.
Yeah.
And it felt so good for me because my dad, like yourself, is a Steelers fan. So I'd always heard about the 2 Super Bowls. Yeah, okay, yeah, okay, there you go. Well, this time I got my revenge.
You did indeed. And Barry Switzer gets his Super Bowl ring. The offensive line is still the offensive line. Dallas's defense wasn't quite as dominant, but they're helped out by the fact that the Steelers' offense made some terrible and silly mistakes.
Larry Brown.
And of course, Larry Brown. Yes, thank you, Neil O'Donnell, for making Larry Brown a household name.
Yes.
But yes.
Yeah.
Probably the least impressive, ironically, player on that defense ends up being the MVP. But
MVP. Yep.
That was a loaded defense, a lot of great players, but Larry Brown really wasn't one of them. But he did end up getting it because of those interceptions. Once again, way to go, Neil O'Donnell.
And then, of course, the Packers come into Louisiana again and basically destroyed the New England Patriots 35-21. I mean, this was another horrible game. It was ugly. It really was a super boring game yet again.
So I've been throwing, garlands, flowers, roses, whatever, at defensive tackles, particularly, right? We talked about what, Bob Lilly did and what Manny Fernandez did and what Mean Joe Green did. Reggie White now must get his. And Reggie White was one of those guys that rushed the passer from multiple spots. He would go all the way out to wide 9 and sometimes play it, 3 tech, 4-eye, 5. Well, wherever he lined up, you couldn't handle him. You could not be handled. The Patriots had no answer, and I mean no answer for him. Leroy Butler had a good day. I mean, lots of their defenders had good days, but to me, it was all about Reggie White. Reggie White, who was the first big, Plan B free agent when free agency really got underway, goes to Green Bay as the jewel in the crown of now what we know as free agency, and almost immediately delivers on what they brought him in to do.
Yeah.
He changed everything about the way that team played defense because, once again, he demands a double team on every play.
And then the very next year, we see the first 2 Super Bowl victories for the Broncos, the 31-24 over the Packers. Reggie White didn't have enough to stop John Elway. Didn't have enough, and again, the next season after that is I believe Dan Reeves' final attempt at a Super Bowl, where the Broncos lose 34-19. Again, it was a super bore of a game. Yeah. The Broncos were just basically all over the Falcons.
Yep.
And then we enter the new millennium, and we've got the greatest show on turf, the St. Louis Rams.
So we talked earlier about Sid Gilman and the precepts of that offense, which the Dallas Cowboys also ran a version of, are now been stretched, right?
Yeah.
So despite the fact that Gilman is thought of as this, wild innovator, he always had a fullback. Well, the fullback is now gone. In the Mike Martz version, Vermeil has also taken some of it, but Mike Martz version of that Gilman offense, Ricky Prohl is now on the field as that slot receiver. Once again, the emergence of the slot receiver, and you have Torrey Holt and Isaac Bruce, and they throw the ball to tight ends sometimes, but mostly they're throwing it to one of those three wide receivers, or we talked about running backs and catch the ball. Maybe one of the greatest, maybe the greatest receiving back, one of the greatest of all time, in one Marshall Faulk. Marshall Faulk, brilliant mind, amazing hands, speed, power, basically the perfect running back for this offense, or probably any offense, probably, but for this offense, particularly because he catches the ball so well, runs routes like a receiver. The offensive line has Orlando Pace and some other really good offensive line, but one truly great one. The defense is good enough, solid. They play well enough, they do enough, and of course, obviously, Robert Jones makes that very famous game-saving play, on the last play of the game. But it's once again, we talk about bores. There's nothing boring about this game. This is once again one of the great Super Bowls, one of the top 5, 6, 7 Super Bowls of all time.
Yeah, exactly right. And then, of course, the Baltimore Ravens, with a defense like nobody else had, absolutely stoned the New York Giants 34-7. And I mean, this game was over in a hurry. That Ravens defense just pounded the Giants that day. There was nothing the Giants could do. Again, it was a great defensive performance. And then we had the game where I think some guy named Brady. I think Brady. What did he ever do in this league? Tom Brady.
It's funny. It's funny because there's so many reasons why his career should have never happened. So he's taken, obviously, famously, his pick 199, 6th round, and sits. Not only sits, but is inactive for an entire year. Because he's a 4th. I didn't misspeak. Not 3rd. He's a 4th string quarterback.
Yep.
He's behind people like, is it Damon Eward? One of the Ewards.
Damon Eward, Drew Bledsoe.
Yeah, he's behind the Scott Zolaks and Damon Ewards and obviously Bledsoes of the world. He's buried in the depth chart. To his credit, he works like crazy all year. Works year round. Doesn't go home to California. Doesn't do anything. Stays and works with their quarterbacks coach and is in the ear of the coordinators all the time, and he's studying and he's working out. And so there's a full-on battle. He doesn't quite win it, but he impresses everybody, the veterans and the coaching staff, with how close he makes it. And people forget how good Drew Bledsoe was. Bledsoe's coming off of a 30, not quite 4,000, but 3,800 yard passing year. He had a great season the year before.
Yeah.
And was a Pro Bowl starter and all this kind of stuff. And might have been second.
And now you blame the New York Jets.
Marvin Jones, Florida State. Yeah,
exactly, for injuring Drew Bledsoe, and all of a sudden, this kid from the University of Michigan, who was not even a full-time starter at the University of Michigan either, he was being pulled. So this guy deserves his credit, and that's why he was a 6th round pick. But again, Thomas Brady. And of course, this is the Super Bowl after the 9/11 thing, and they come out and beat the Rams 20-17, and it was quite the spectacle. Mm-hmm. Then of course we had the John Gruden mess.
Yep.
Gruden who had been the Raiders head coach and had been fired, and all of a sudden found himself in Tampa Bay. You want to talk about a boring Super Bowl? 48-21. He knew everything that the Raiders were running. He knew absolutely every play that they had. He knew it backwards and forwards, and his defense just destroyed the Oakland Raiders that day.
He gave them all their side adjustments, all their hots, all their protection. Gave them everything. He gave them everything. And he literally ran scout team as quarterback because he knew Gannon's everything. His move.
He knew everything that Gannon was going to do because he had already been the scout guy with the Raiders as well. That's one thing about Gruden is he would still throw the football.
Yeah.
you know. And of course, there were no more creamsicles uniforms either in Tampa Bay at that time. So that was heaven sent. And then of course we had the Patriots returning again. They beat the Carolina Panthers 32-29. That was one game that I wasn't really thrilled with either side. I'm not too sure. There was really nothing. I don't know how they got that many points, really.
It wasn't Brady's best work, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't Brady's best work. Delhomme made some mistakes sort of down the stretch of that game that helped to give it back. The Patriots could have very easily lost that game. The Patriots could have very easily. The Carolina Panthers played really, really well. Like they're sort of a forgotten team. Like how good that version of the Panthers was is sort of lost to history. Steve Smith is a guy that probably maybe one day make the Hall of Fame. Ricky Prohl, the aforementioned Ricky Prohl, right, former member of the Greatest Show on Turf, and they've got Mushin Muhammad, a couple of good running backs. A little running back tandem that was good in Stewart and Williams. They've got Sam Mills, and they've got.
Yep. I liked this version of the Carolina Panthers team much better than I ever did the Cam Newton version. I'm sorry, I did. I like that version of the early 2000s Carolina Panthers team, and then of course the Patriots go on to. They beat the Eagles, who are now 0-2 in Super Bowls, 24-21, a much closer game than people thought it would be.
Yep. A thrilling game, really.
It was a very thrilling game.
And McNabb, despite all of the things that people said, actually played really well. He played a really good game. Now, did he gas out? Was he exhausted towards the end? I'm going to chalk some of that up to nerves. He was apparently super, super pumped for this game. Knew he wanted to sort of make a name for himself as a chance to topple the Patriots. And he played, for the most part, like I said, a really good game. And obviously Terrell Owens is out there playing with a screw still in his leg and all that stuff. Forgotten also is how well the defense of the Eagles played down the stretch.
And they did.
To keep the Patriots in sight, in distance, because they could have easily pulled away. And like I said, that I thought was a terrific game. One of my favorite Super Bowls actually is that one. There was a good blend of offense and defense. It wasn't just a shootout, and it wasn't a slog. It was a good blend of some exciting plays on offense and defense.
Well, exactly right. And then your Steelers come back to the Super Bowl. And this game was played in Ford Field in Detroit, Michigan, which comes into play here.
Yes, it does.
Yes, because the Steelers, led by Jerome Bettis of Notre Dame, and his son's also going to Notre Dame this year, kids.
And Cass Technical High School also, if memory serves correctly.
Yep, exactly. So they beat up on Seattle 21-10. I mean, this was a typical Steelers game. They pounded you on the ground, and the defense just stymied you, and that was it.
Yeah. So, like with Bradshaw early in his Super Bowl career, Roethlisberger is essentially a passenger. He makes one really great play, and it's really a defensive play. He prevents what probably would have been a defensive touchdown.
Exactly.
By making a tackle. But for the most part, as a actual quarterback, he's doing just enough. He's handing the ball off. He's competing a few little short passes. He's trying to avoid making the big mistake. And like I said, he does just enough.
Yeah. And then the next season, of course, is Peyton Manning finally gets to a Super Bowl game.
Yep.
And the Colts win it 29-17. Again, this one was a boring game to me. It was boring because you knew the Colts were just going to beat up on that Bears team.
Well, here's what I'll say about that Bears team. And once again, a terrific defense. Urlacher and Briggs and Peanut Tillman and they had.
And rest in peace to Dick Jauron. who was the former head coach of the Bears and the Bills.
Jerron, yep. And Yale, outstanding Yale running back before that, Jerron. That team was put together similarly to the '85 team, but they didn't have quite the same insanely good pass rush. That was the real difference.
Exactly.
They were a good defense, but they didn't have that on you in 2 seconds, or less.
There was nobody that was going to get in Peyton Manning's face.
They didn't have a Dan Hampton. They didn't have a Richard Dent or even a Steve McMichael. Right? They had good, even very good, but no great defensive linemen, like guys that would get Hall of Fame consideration. So that's the big difference. They couldn't get enough pressure. And Peyton picked them apart. Yeah. And obviously, Rex Grossman, who is himself also a guy that just sort of keeps the truck out of the ditch. When you ask him to do more, then you end up with the truck in the ditch. And so once they got down a couple scores, now once again, that game was essentially over at that point.
And then of course the New York Giants come in and play a undefeated New England Patriots team.
Yep.
And they get the 3-point win, 17-14, which I'm sorry, you Giants fans, Eli Manning is not a Hall of Fame quarterback. Yes, he had the 2 Super Bowls, but he was never a Pro Bowler. He was not even, he was never that type of a player. And then of course, to me, the most exciting Super Bowl I've ever seen, how the game ended. Your Steelers beat Kurt Warner and the Arizona Cardinals 27-23. How that man caught that football is beyond me.
Antonio Holmes will be remembered
forever.
Forever. And he should be remembered forever for that play. So, and San Antonio's 5'11" and 3/8, right? If he's 5'11" and a quarter, that doesn't work. It doesn't happen.
Nope.
It is truly one of the throw is insane. The catch is even more insane. And then you add to it, the play that, right as halftime's happening that James Harrison makes. It is bingo. There's so many big, huge plays. Like Fitzgerald makes some big, huge plays.
Yep.
Like it was a people use terms like heavyweight fight, slugfest, whatever, all too often. But it fits the tempo of that game. Haymakers were being thrown and landed in that game.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So for this one, it actually, like I said, overused terminology, but it makes sense for this game. It's also my favorite Super Bowl, not just because my Steelers won, because it was you couldn't tear your eyes away.
It was close to being exactly what we had last year as an overtime game here. Right. It was as close as you were ever going to see two teams just duking it out.
Yep.
That should have gone to overtime.
It was an amazing, it was absolutely amazing game.
Yeah, but the Steelers, of course, they win their Super Bowl, and then of course the next season after that we have Drew Brees leading the Saints against the Manning Colts.
Yep.
And of course the Colts lose 31-17. That Saints team was just dynamite.
Yeah, and the turning point is Drew Brees going for that. Is Sean Payton going for that onside kick. Because I truly believe that if he kicks the ball back to the Colts score, and whether it's Colts win or lose, it's at least going to be a dogfight all the way to the end. Yeah, that's going to be a 3-point game. It's decided late, as opposed to the way it ends up turning out. But that extra possession and that score turns the tide of that game, and now he's got the Colts. I won't say panicked, but they're playing the game differently.
They stopped doing what had been working earlier on, and that just killed them. It just killed them. And then the next season it was ugly. I don't care what anybody says. This game absolutely was ugly. It was the game where Aaron Rodgers went back to AT&T Stadium, where he had many successes, and your Steelers lost 31-25, which it really upset me, Bill. It really upset me.
Yeah. Well, Aaron Charles Rodgers, who, of course, it's funny. At the time, you're thinking, oh, my God, how many more times is he going to be here, hoisting the Lombardi Trophy? People were projecting that he might be a guy that might, win 4 or 5 or 6, right? I mean, I remember people talking about that. All the big talking heads, all the big, big name people were talking about how many might. It was once again, the Packers were a young team at the time. They had all of their best players were in their mid-20s.
Exactly.
It looked like they were going to be a dynasty.
And it just didn't happen. I feel so bad. And then, of course, Eli Manning shows up again and beats the Patriots again, 21-17.
Right.
And of course, we all know what happened in that game. Then the next one, the Ravens against the 49ers. Harbaugh versus Harbaugh.
The Harbaugh, yes. Another one of those.
Correct. John Harbaugh won this game over that other brother of his who went to that school up north and coached that school up north. You guys all know I hate that school up north. So the right brother won this game. And of course, the power went out.
Yep.
Yeah.
And once again, people forget how close that game got to be.
Yeah.
The Ravens jump out and they're dominating. And yes, whether you want to believe conspiracy theories or whatever, the run game for the 49ers gets going, right? They're in that pistol, and they've got Kaepernick, who has a freakish arm, in addition to being terrifically athletic. Frank Gore,
Frank Gore was just
future Hall of Famer.
He was phenomenal.
And Vernon Davis, who's shorter, but incredibly athletic tight end. Sort of a precursor to George Kittle, but even faster. This guy ran 4.38 at 248 pounds. But yeah, it was a dynamic offense. They had enough on defense. One Hall of Famer, right? At least so far, but in Patrick Willis, but some other really, really good players on that defense. And they staged that furious comeback, coming up just a little bit short. But that was a great Super Bowl. That's once again, to me, one of the top. If we talked about what number 1 is, and I think we went through the number 2 came up. This is probably in that 3 to 5 or 6 range for me. Also, as one of the Super Bowls.
And then, of course, we had an absolute blowout the next season. The Broncos yet again blown out by the Seahawks, 43-8. I mean, it was a boring game.
This may have been the least compelling of all the Super Bowls I've ever seen.
Yeah, like it was total destruction. And then, of course, the Seahawks come back the next season, and they play the Patriots, and we all know what happened. They were on the 1-yard line, and they didn't give the ball to Marshawn Lynch. Good night, over. That was Pete Carroll's worst decision of ever. Period. I mean, you had Marshawn Lynch. You're 1 yard away. You run that ball in and you win. But no.
Well, it's a top, to me, another one of these top 4 or 5 Super Bowls of all time. It was a very compelling game, a good mix of offense and defense. Both defenses really came to play.
Yep.
And you had some big plays on offense. The Patriots did a decent job of slowing down Marshawn Lynch. The passing attack of Seattle did just enough. And on that drive, though, Russell Wilson got hot. People forget how well Russell Wilson played in that little stretch, throwing to, once again, these are NFL wide receivers, but, Jermaine Kearse and Doug Baldwin, these are not household names, and maybe in their own households. Yeah. And then that final play is designed for Lockett, right? To run that little rub with was it Kearse or was it Baldwin? I think it's Baldwin. Like
Oh,
they just run
it should. Yeah,
the
it would have been
other part of that rub.
Yeah.
And of course, if it works, he's a genius. But
It didn't.
well, because Malcolm Butler, who
Yep.
wasn't even a starter when that season begins, he's an undrafted free agent who's bouncing back and forth between the practice squad and doing some special teams, who works his way into being a starter. They had practiced, against that. They thought that they might see that play and had practiced against it. And ironically, the last practice, it works, right? It works against them. And Butler gets pulled aside and gets coached up some more by Belichick, and takes it to heart. And of course, obviously makes the play there. But both defenses, like I said, made some big plays in that game. Both offenses had some big plays as well. But I thought that was a really compelling Super Bowl.
Yeah. And then the next Super Bowl, of course, was the Broncos 24-10 over Cam Newton's Panthers. And as I said before, give me the Jake Delhomme era Panthers over this version of the Panthers any day of the week. And it's not just because I don't like Cam Newton, folks. It's just because that he was a good quarterback. He could run the football and all that jazz, but he just didn't have enough to face that Broncos defense. That Broncos defense was mean and nasty. And don't give me this Peyton Manning led them. No, it was the defense that won the game.
Well, I mean, Aqib Talib and what was the other one from Kansas? The other Chris Harris and obviously Von Miller's coming out party.
Yeah.
Not that Von Miller hadn't come out already, but good Lord, was he an unstoppable killing machine in that game?
And then we got our first overtime game, where the Falcons were up 28-3,
right, famously,
and lose to Brady 34-28. We all know what happened to Dan Quinn's defense; it just disappeared, and Brady had a field day.
Yeah, and more importantly, or equally as important, was the Falcons lost the ability to possess the ball. Like not only were they not scoring, once you got in halfway through the third quarter, they weren't even really holding on to the ball. It was 3 and out, 3 and out. Maybe, they only had, I think, 2 possessions where they didn't go 3 and out. Once you got past into that last. Once you got past the first part of the third quarter. And some people are critical of the fact that, Shanahan didn't run the ball enough. I mean, you can criticize a lot of different things, but the defense collapsed at least in part because the offense had them on the field constantly. And, you add to that, that Brady figured out, in essence, the Falcons defense. And once that happened, once they'd figured out, oh, okay, here's what's open, here's what's there, here's how we can, exploit. Because the thing about that Earhart offense, the offense that they run in New England, is that it's got elements of both. It's got elements of it's got a little bit of run and shoot. It's got elements of West Coast, but it's sort of based-ish in, once again, it's got everything. It's got some Gilman stuff too. But what they do, in essence, is they use that triangular stuff that you get from West Coast, but they always have a vertical. They also use more vertical stretch, often with the tight end, right, as opposed to. And so once you have that seam,
Gronkowski was huge that day.
Once you have that seam stretch, that's taking somebody out of the box. That's either a safety or a linebacker is having to run deep. And now that means that either once that underneath receiver beats their coverage person, they have lots of space to work with, or
they were gone.
Right. Or if it's a draw play, if that person makes it past the D line, they're getting 12 to 17 yards. So little plays can become big plays because of that seam stretch, that sending Gronkowski or Hernandez when he was there up that seam vertically. It hurts you because either you're giving a big play to that person running up the seam, or if you take that away, now somebody underneath is getting that wide open.
It's getting wide open, exactly. And of course, the next season is another ugly one as far as I'm concerned, because I mean, The Eagles of all teams, the last NFC East team to ever win a Super Bowl, the Philadelphia Eagles, but they did beat up on Tom Brady and the Patriots that day. So for that, you get full credit for that. Carson Wentz, of course, had been this superstar and he ends up getting banged up, and Nick Foles comes in. He leads the Philadelphia Eagles to their first Super Bowl title. Then,
ironically, against Thomas Edward Patrick Brady, whose destiny had unfolded similarly to when Nicholas Foles. I think it was the first game where you had over 900 yards, most Super Bowl. We had over 900 plus yards passing. Yeah. So to me, it's a top 5 Super Bowl. If there was a little defense, I might have pushed it up even a little higher. But both teams were just moving the ball up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And, Nick Foles just came up big every time he had to. And Brady played really, really well. I mean, I want to make it clear.
He played well. He played well. It was a 74-point game. I mean, there was not a whole lot of defense being executed all day long.
Right. But he came up one drive short.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, the next year, was this ever a boring game? 13-3, the Patriots beat the Rams.
Yeah.
It was so boring. Just horrible offenses by both teams. The defenses played well, obviously, the 13-3 game, but it was ugly to watch.
Right. And once again, some of that was defenses, but some of it was just ineptitude
on offense. It was horrible. Right. Oh, absolutely horrifying. And then there's some guy named Patrick Mahomes. And
he would have been there the year previous if not for one D Ford's over-eagerness. So
exactly. But again, the Kansas City Chiefs beat up on the 49ers 31-20. I enjoyed that first Kansas City Super Bowl victory.
Yes.
Then, of course, the next year, Patrick Mahomes has a bad toe. Bad for Kansas City as they go down 31-9 to Tampa Bay.
Yep.
Then we have the Rams play the Bengals, and what a game that was. I mean, it was phenomenal. 23-20, the Rams win their Super Bowl. They finally get one in Los Angeles.
Yep. And it was another, I would say, maybe not top 5, but not much outside of the top 5. Maybe number 6 Super Bowl of all time. It was, once again, there was some good defense being played. I'm throwing Garland's flowers over Aaron Charles Donald. You're getting your flowers now. Aaron Charles Donald's getting his flowers now. He came up big, especially in key moments. He would get pressures and sacks at exactly the time when you needed them. And the Rams had enough offense. I put it. They had timely offense. Right.
Exactly. And then the next Super Bowl, which is one that I predicted correctly, as soon as that second the NFC game was over, I said in the chat room, 38-35, Kansas City was going to beat the Eagles. That's exactly what happened. So, of course, that was another very super exciting game.
Right. 2 black quarterbacks for the first
time. And all that great stuff that happened as well. Then last year, Kansas City Chiefs beat San Francisco in overtime.
Yep.
25-22. And you just knew that Mahomes was going to be in there. He just, as soon as they kicked that field goal, that was it. He was going to go down that field and they were going to score the touchdown. You just knew it. It was over. And again, that was much more of a defense game than Patrick Mahomes was in his previous.
The flowers are now about to be flung at the feet of one Chris Jones.
Chris Jones.
He came up once again, like we just said about Donald, pressures and sacks exactly when you needed them. He just wreaked havoc, and that's a good offense. That's a great offense. In fact, That's a great offense. That's a good offensive line. I mean, they've got Trent Williams. That's a terrific offense. They've got that terrifically schemed up run attack. They've got good wide receivers who are great after the catch. Beating that team.
And they had Mr. Irrelevant from Mr. Brock Purdy, who of course on Draft Central when I was on with you and Jeff that year said, the 49ers got themselves a very good. And I had people saying, "What are you talking about? Did you not see his junior season at Iowa State? Did you not see him? He had no receiving talent his last year. Sorry,
correct. Yeah,
he didn't have any.
But even more to the point, once he was in an offense that played to his strengths.
Oh,
as good as he was at Iowa State, that's not really an offense that plays to his strengths. I mean,
no.
Catch and release spread is not what he does best. He's now under center a fair amount of time. They run good old fashioned classic play action and RPOs and stuff like that as well. But all that they do is built around. He's a really good ball handler. He's smart. He has quick release. He reminds me of really a modern day version of a guy like Greasy, right? A little bigger, a little stronger, but modern weight training, nutrition, and he's a little more athletic, but decision making, quick release, tough, smart. Those are things that make him great. He's not a guy that has a cannon for an arm. He's obviously not 6'5", but he does the little things extremely well and at such a high level that they become big things.
He's very accurate, which is a key thing. Accuracy, accurate and smart means Joe Montana. And Joe Montana won 4 of those. So Brock Purdy isn't quite at Joe Montana's level. I'm sorry, but he was still a very smart and accurate quarterback. So again, that was a decent victory for the Chiefs. Tomorrow game, since you do the videos for the Kansas City Chiefs, have you made a prediction?
I have made a prediction. Should I reveal it here?
Yeah, you should tell me.
So I do think 44 points was scored. I think it's going to be 27-17. I think that the Eagles defense forces a couple of turnovers. I think one fumble and maybe an interception. And I think they score off those 2 turnovers. I think that they get up early on the Chiefs. The Chiefs stage a comeback and get it to being a 1-score game, and then that second turnover happens. Right, the first one gets them to that early lead, and the second one happens. They score once again, maybe a field goal at that point or something to sort of pad their lead, and then they're able to basically survive the onslaught towards the end. I think that the Chiefs are denied the three-peat. Though I think it'll be touch and go for a while. I think it's not until fairly late in the game that the Eagles pull away and get that second score to go up.
So you are in agreement with what I said to begin this year when I said the Chiefs would not three-peat. Very, very good. Now I've got a much higher rate. I've got more scoring happening. I got a lot more scoring happening. I think Saquon Barkley does go wild against that Chiefs defense because the Philadelphia offensive line will beat up that front, and I don't care how many different guys the Chiefs put out front. The Philadelphia Eagles offensive line is the best group I've seen in years. Yeah. And they will beat up the front 7 of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Saquon gets 2 touchdowns. Jalen Hurts will also score 2 touchdowns, but not from the brotherly shove. There will be no brotherly shove in this game. I'm sorry, Colleen Wolfe and all those other NFL Network folks who talk about the brotherly shove. Then I have Dallas Goedert with a touchdown as well.
Huh.
And I have Quinyon Mitchell with a pick 6 off Patrick Mahomes. I've got it 42-31.
Oh, wow. Okay,
I've got lots of points. I got lots of points being scored. Yeah. So Mark and Thomas both know that I'm supporting the Eagles this time because, of course, the last time it was the 38-35 victory for the Chiefs that I said. This time, I'm sorry. I've got to stick to the NFC East, even though it's the Eagles. But yes, they get their second Super Bowl victory.
Yeah, well, I think it'll be a good and exciting game. Now, if it's as high scoring as you are saying, that'll be better for the ratings than the game that I'm predicting.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I just think
I
both
see a lot of people with low scores in this game, and have you not seen this offensive line for the Eagles and what they do to teams? They beat up defensive fronts, and they play some damn good defenses this year.
Yeah. Both.
You
I think
know?
both defenses play well. I do think the offensive line. I think it comes later, though. I think the offensive line is able later to get they're like some of those things that are small plays in the first and second quarter, and even through the first half of the third quarter, become bigger plays. I think Saquon gets loose later in the game. I think on a screen or something in the halfway through the third quarter, he gets his first touchdown there. I think that I do agree there's a rushing touchdown by Jalen. I think it's earlier in the game. And I think there's a touchdown by maybe Gainwell or somebody, like on a, maybe a little, like almost speed option kind of thing,
Yeah.
to get them to
that one I don't see happening, but I do see Dallas Goedert getting loose for a touchdown as well. And then I said Quinyon Mitchell, just because of the draft that you and I participated in last year. And you saw my reaction every time Howie Roseman was picking. I'm just like, oh God, no. Oh no, this is happening. This is happening.
Yeah. Well,
Not only did they have Quinyon Mitchell, then Cooper DeJean, and it's just like, oh no.
He had an incredible draft. Yeah, he had an incredible draft.
I mean, it was just like a nightmare. This was a nightmare for me. And it is for everybody else in this league.
Yeah, that Eagles team's going to be good for a while. The core of that team they're going to lose, a couple of guys, but the core of that team is coming back. So they're probably going to lose.
They have no money issues. Listen to me here, Jerry and Stephen Jones. Listen to me here, okay? They have no money issues until 2029. That season, they have $177 million dead cap hit coming in 2029. Right. Jerry and Steven, you better sign Micah so you have money to sign free agents, and don't wait until it's the bottom of the training camp time for signing guys, okay? It's just unbelievable. I mean, the Eagles went into this year with $63 million in dead money. They got Bond on a one-year deal, $3.5 million. They signed Barkley. I mean, it's not that difficult, guys.
Right. And they're going to move on from some guys. They're going to restructure some guys. They'll make it work because they always make it work. But they're drafting, and then what they do in free agency, they seem to almost never miss in free agency, and they draft so well. Like I said, this team's not going anywhere. They're going to be good next year and the year after that and the year after that.
Yeah. No, they're going to be a tough team. But it's been a very good year.
Yes. Great.
A great year for football. And of course, you and myself are back on the air Wednesday night. With Mr. Jeff Barnes for Team MBS Media's Draft Central. And we'll be doing offensive guards and defensive tackles.
Yes.
With our grades for everybody. Oh, by the way, I have reached the 400 player number now. I stopped today at 400. I've scouted 400 players. I'm proud of myself.
I'm proud of you.
I mean,
I've got some catching up to do. You're a couple hundred ahead of me, Greg. Here you go.
Well, hey, but how I've done mine this year was because I was watching so many games this year. I had my notepad out and I was making notes on every senior that there was. And a lot of the guys who returned this year, I also already had my notes on it as it was, right? So I was just adding little things to them or taking something away for this year compared to their season last year and all that other jazz. But which I had when the season was over, I had a 285 guys because because as you know, I don't pay attention to what happens in the All-Star games. Like I like their practices and all that jazz. That's great. But I don't weigh their performance in an All-Star game very heavily. And then the only other thing I'm worried about is the medical issues at the draft. That's it.
Yeah.
So, but
yeah,
there you have it.
Combine, Yep. Gives us insight into health, and then helps us, first of all, just height, weight, speed. A lot of guys, we don't know exactly what size or how fast they are. It helps you differentiate between guys that might end up playing guard versus tackle, or standing up and playing defensive end versus linebacker in a odd front defense.
Well,
Corners from safety.
Jeff is going to be going to the combine this year, and he's going to be very busy because I need to know Siobhan Revelle, Benjamin Morrison, and Josh Simmons. Those are the only three people I want him paying any attention to, because those are the guys with the big injury concerns. And, Jeff, you're going to have to get us that information, especially Benjamin Morrison from Notre Dame. I mean, come on now. But again, and this whole draft is going to be wild. It is going to be a wild year, because I've only got 12 first-round players this year, Bill. 12. Like, me, I'm usually around 18 to 20.
Yeah, I probably have a few more than you. I'm probably going to end up around 16 or 17. But yeah, there's a lot of guys who are going the first who don't have first round grades this year.
Yeah. So, I mean, everybody can go all crazy about, yes, he's our first round pick. Is he a first round grade? No. There's very few of them out there to me. There's very few of them this year. And again,
it's a great year to have a lot of picks in the second to fourth rounds. Be second, third, and fourth.
Oh round. Yeah. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So, folks, this has been the final word for tonight. I hope everybody enjoys their Super Bowl game tomorrow.
Yes.
And fly, Eagles, fly. Okay, I said it. I've
there
said
you
it.
Go. There you go. You did it.
I'm not going to sing that song. There's no way I'm ever going to
do that.
But yes, it's fly, Eagles, fly tomorrow.
It is.
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.